Hello, and welcome back to the Librarian of the Rings. My name is Ben, I'm the Librarian, and today we're going to be talking about the question, was Aragorn black? You know, when Magic the Gathering Universes Beyond Tales of Middle-earth came out last year, there was a whole lot of controversy because they introduced a depiction of Aragorn where he was black. This happens to be one of my favorite cards here. This is Anduril, Flame of the West, and it depicts Aragorn as a black man carrying the beautiful sword Anduril. And there was a whole lot of controversy around this at that time, and I think now that it's been about a year, we've had some time to think on this, I want to come back to it, and I want to look at it through the lens of research, because I'm a librarian, and that's what we do. Now, from the outset, let me just go ahead and say that I have comment moderation turned on for this video for obvious reasons. This can become a very heated topic, and so while I'm not turning comments off, I am moderating all comments on it to make sure that they are appropriate. I'm happy to hear your comments even if you disagree with my opinion, but I do ask that you follow a few simple rules. First, before commenting, please watch the video in its entirety so that you know exactly what I've said. Second, if you are professing something as more than your own opinion, please make sure that you are citing the source for it so that we know where we can find it in the writings of J.R.R. Tolkien. And lastly, I ask that you be respectful of everyone, that you not use swear words or any other inappropriate language. Now, personally, as I said, I really like this depiction of Aragorn. This happens to be the card Anduril. Aragorn is depicted by many different artists in this set, but they all are clearly working from the same brief, describing him in the same visual language. So he always appears as a black man with dark hair. He looks very regal and very kingly, which I always think is a really defining trait of Aragorn in the books. Now, why do people have so much difficulty with this? Before we get to the research, let's talk a little bit about that. Well, I think it has a lot to do with people's expectations. People have gotten very used over the last more than 20 years to thinking of Aragorn as Vigo. And Vigo is white. And so when they see a depiction that's not what they're used to, their expectations aren't met, they tend to kind of rally really hard against it. And so what we want to know is whether or not this depiction of Aragorn is in any way accurate to what J.R.R. Tolkien talked about in the books. And I should say right off the bat that Vigo's depiction of Aragorn isn't accurate to the books. We can't use that as a standard to measure this artwork against. Now we're going to get into the research, but first off, I just want to say I'm not exactly sure why Aragorn received so much of the angst around this when Magic the Gathering set came out, because there are actually a lot more clear depictions of problems. For example, the writers of the Rohirrim are repeatedly described as the orcs as being white skins, and they are depicted in the set as being black. Now, I don't really think that that is a huge problem, but it is a more clear violation than anything that I could remember about Aragorn's description in the books. But I think Aragorn is just a very popular character. He's one everyone knows well, and like I said, very associated with Viggo Mortensen at this point in time, and so it just came as a shock to them to see it. He was also displayed on a lot of the promotional material, and he has a lot of cards in the set. In addition to his Aragorn cards, there's also a Strider card, and multiple cards that aren't creature cards, but are depicting him. Okay, so now let's get into the research. Getting accurate information out there is one of the things that's really important to librarians as information professionals. And I actually spent a number of years at a university teaching information literacy and research methods to new students. And so this is something that we do a lot, is to help people find accurate information and then be able to draw conclusions from that information. So that's what we're going to do now. Now, it took me a long time to research for this video, and it's going to be kind of a long video because there are a lot of descriptions that we need to go through in order to kind of see what Tolkien actually said in the books about Aragorn. So we're going to start with the descriptions from the Lord of the Rings itself about Aragorn, and then we'll move into some ancillary things that might help us to determine what Aragorn would have looked like. But when we get there, it's important to remember that Magic the Gathering people would have been operating under a license that restricted them to only using the things that were in the Lord of the Rings or the Hobbit. Even if they have this other information, they can't necessarily get out there and use it. Let's start with Tolkien's first description of Aragorn when Frodo first sees Strider in the prancing pony. Suddenly, Frodo noticed that a strange-looking weather-beaten man sitting in the shadows near the wall was also listening intently to the hobbit talk. He had a tall tankard in front of him and was smoking a long-stemmed pipe curiously carved. His legs were stretched out before him, showing high boots of supple leather that fitted him well, but had seen much wear and were now caked with mud. A travel-stained cloak of heavy dark green cloth was drawn close about him, and in spite of the heat of the room, he wore a hood that overshadowed his face. But the gleam of his eyes could be seen as he watched the hobbits. "Who is that?" Frodo asked when he got a chance to whisper to Mr. Butterbur. "I don't think you introduced him." "Him?" said the landlord in an answering whisper, cocking his eye without turning his head. "I don't rightly know. He's one of the wandering folk. Rangers, we call them. He seldom talks. Not but what he can tell a rare tale when he has the mind. He disappears for a month or a year, and then he pops up again. He was in and out pretty often last spring, but I haven't seen him about lately. What his right name is, I've never heard, but he's known round here as Strider. Goes about at a great pace on his long shanks, though he don't tell nobody what cause he has to hurry." And then in that same chapter, we get where Frodo actually approaches him. Presently, with a wave of his hand and a nod, he invited Frodo to come over and sit by him. As Frodo drew near, he threw back his hood, showing a shaggy head of dark hair flecked with gray, and a pale, stern face, a pair of keen gray eyes. So on this description from the outset, we actually have no description of Aragorn's skin color. Anyone of any complexion can be described as being pale. That's just something that happens. What we do know is that he has dark hair and that it's flecked with gray, and that he has long legs and he's quite tall. The next description we get is in Gandalf's letter. "You may meet a friend of mine on the road, a man, lean, dark, tall, by some called Strider." So here Gandalf describes Aragorn as being dark, but again, just like pale, anyone can be described as being dark. And so it's not necessarily descriptive at all about his skin color or complexion. So now we have both pale and dark in just a matter of a few pages, and so there really isn't anything to go off of at this point. The next description that we give Strider is in the next chapter as the hobbits and he are traveling along. "Frodo lay down again, but for a long while he could still see the white flashes, and against them the tall, dark figure of Strider, standing silent and watchful." So once again, we get a description of him as being dark, but this is obviously going to be more of a description of him as a silhouette against the white flashes of light coming from Weathertop. And so that's not really something where we could be like, oh yes, he has dark skin. The next description is a short one that we get while they're in the snow trying to get up to the Red Horn Gate. "Aragorn was the tallest in the company." That's it. He's tall. This is a common description of Aragorn. The next description is going to come when the company is leaving Lothlorien. "Then Aragorn took the stone and pinned the brooch upon his breast, and those who saw him wondered, for they had not marked before how tall and kingly he stood, and it seemed to them that many years of toil fallen from shoulders." So this is the first of the descriptions where we start to get Aragorn being transformed into a kingly person. A lot of these descriptions from here on out aren't going to be all that useful when we think about actually visually drawing a picture of Aragorn, because a lot of it is more of him transforming in a spiritual sense that people can see, but it's not necessarily a physical thing. But let's go ahead and read them and see what we can glean from it. When they come to the Argonath, it says, "Frodo turned and saw Strider, and yet not Strider, for the weather-worn ranger was no longer there. In the stern sat Aragorn, son of Arathorn, proud and erect, guiding the boat with skillful strokes. His hood was cast back, and his dark hair was blowing in the wind. A light was in his eyes, a king returning from exile to his own land." So the only really physical description we get here is that he has dark hair and that it is long enough to blow in the wind. Now, of course, in the Peter Jackson films, Aragorn is shown with quite long hair, and we do have some pictures here from the Magic the Gathering set where his hair is blowing, but it's not nearly that long. But this doesn't really describe the length, just that it was long enough to blow in the wind. Continuing on with not very concrete descriptions, we get this one when they encounter Éomer. "Gimli and Legolas looked at their companion in amazement, for they had not seen him in this mood before. He seemed to have grown in stature, while Éomer had shrunk, and in his living face they caught a brief vision of the power and majesty of the kings of stone. For a moment it seemed to the eyes of Legolas that a white flame flickered on the brows of Aragorn like a shining crown." So again, we're getting kind of this spiritual transformation of Aragorn as he comes into his own, as he prepares to return as the king, but not a lot of physical description. Then when the three of them are talking with Gandalf, it says, "The gray figure of a man, Aragorn, son of Arathorn, was tall and stern as stone, his hand upon the hilt of his sword. He looked as if some king out of the mists of the sea had stepped upon the shores of lesser men." And then when Éowyn sees him, and she now was suddenly aware of him, tall heir of kings, wise with many winters, grey-cloaked, hiding a power that yet she felt. Then Merry sees him at the Hornburg, but Merry had eyes only for Aragorn, so startling was the change that he saw in him, as if in one night many years had fallen on his head. Grim was his face, gray-hued and weary. So we get several descriptions of him looking gray or wearing gray or being gray, and that is another one that could be said of anyone. Anyone can look gray when they are troubled. That's not really a matter of skin tone unless it specifically says his skin was gray. The next description comes as he is healing Faramir. For Aragorn's face grew gray with weariness, and ever and anon he called the name of Faramir. And then at the Field of Cormellan we get this description. Aragorn stood beneath his banner, silent and stern, as one lost in thought of things long past or far away. But his eyes gleamed like stars that shine brighter as the night deepens. Next, upon his arrival at Minas Tirith, he was clad in black mail girt with silver. He wore a long mantle of pure white, clasped at the throat, with a great jewel of green that shone from afar, but his head was bare, save for a star upon his forehead, bound by a slender fillet of silver. Continuing with this theme, we go after his coronation. Tall as the sea kings of old, he stood above all that were near. Ancient of days he seemed, and yet in the flower of manhood. And wisdom sat upon his brow, and strength and healing were in his hands, and a light was about him. And then finally, at the parting from the company, they saw the King of the West sitting upon his horse, and his knights about him, and the falling sun shone upon them, and made all their harness to gleam like red gold, and the white mantle of Aragorn was turned to a flame. Then Aragorn took the green stone, and held it up, and there came a green fire from his hand. So that's all the descriptions that I could find of Aragorn within the Lord of the Rings proper. But now let's go to the appendices, because that's also part of the published work that Tolkien published during his lifetime. And the main description that we get here is when Aragorn is going to sleep for the last time as an old man who's ready to stop living. Then a great beauty was revealed in him, so that all who after came there looked on him in wonder, for they saw that the grace of his youth and the valor of his manhood and the wisdom and majesty of his age were blended together. So not a whole lot to go off of there. And I think that what we learn from these actual descriptions of Aragorn in the book is that Tolkien wasn't really worried about describing his race. Otherwise, he just could have. That would be a really easy thing to do. Tolkien doesn't often give us really clear visual descriptions of his characters. He more likes to describe how they make people feel, that kind of thing. There isn't as much description of their actual characteristics. We have a few, like Gandalf's eyebrows coming out beyond the brim of his hat, which is a little bit hard to depict in a picture, but they did it in the graphic novel, which I reviewed a few months ago. But we don't always get that kind of description. Sometimes he's more interested in describing what the character is like than what they look like. And the most description that we get of Aragorn is actually that first one, where a lot of his clothing and attire is described, but he himself doesn't get a lot. His eyes get described a lot because that tells a lot about kind of his spiritual impact. And so I just don't think that Tolkien really cared, but of course we want to dig a little bit deeper in the research, so we're going to look at some other things that might help us to glean information about this kind of ancillary. And the first one is going to be the description of when the Rangers of the North, the Grey Company, come down to meet Aragorn. These are his kin, and so we might be able to surmise that they are similar in skin, although that's not always true. This is what it says. A silence followed, and then in the moonlight a horseman could be seen dismounting and walking slowly. His hand showed white as he held it up, palm outward, in token of peace. But the king's men gripped their weapons. At 10 paces the man stopped. He was tall, a dark standing shadow. So this is a description of Halbarad, one of the Rangers of the North, one of Aragorn's kin. And we get a description of his hand being white. Now that's not really helpful in determining someone's actual skin tone, because palm of anybody's hand can generally be described as white. Even people with very dark skin often have really light palms of their hands. And so that doesn't tell us a whole lot, except that I do think that this flash of white on the hand in the moonlight would be more striking with someone with dark skin than someone with light skin, but would definitely be more striking if everything was dark. This person is described as dark, but that's because it's dark and they're coming out of the shadows. So one other description from the books is worth mentioning here, and this is when Pippin meets Denethor for the first time. It says, Pippin saw his carven face with its proud bones and skin like ivory, and the long curved nose between the dark deep eyes, and he was reminded not so much of Boromir as of Aragorn. So Denethor actually gets a skin description, and that's ivory, which I would take to mean kind of a pale white or a yellowish white. So that's interesting, and then Pippin is reminded of Aragorn. Now we aren't told which of these aspects of Denethor remind him of Aragorn. It could be the skin, it could be the proud bones, it could be the nose, it could just be the very high demeanor of people descended from the Numenoreans. Speaking of the Numenoreans, let's go ahead and let's look at some of the description of the Numenoreans from things outside of the Lord of the Rings. And where I think we get the most useful one is in the nature of Middle-earth. Now, this is a fairly recently published volume, but it contains a lot of Tolkien's writings about the natural history and the nature of the world of Middle-earth. The Numenoreans were not of uniform racial descent. Their main division was between the descendants of the House of Hador and the House of Beor. These two groups originally had distinct languages and in general showed different physical characteristics. Each house had moreover numerous followers of mixed origin. The people of Beor were on the whole dark-haired, though fair-skinned, less tall and less stalwart build. They were also less long-lived. Their Numenorean descendants tended to have smaller lifespan, around 350 years or less. The people of Hador were strong, tall, and for the most part fair-haired. But the chieftains of both houses had already in Librarian intermarried. The line of Elros was regarded as belonging to the House of Hador through Eärendil, son of Tuor, the great grandson of Hador, but it was also descended on the distaff side from the House of Beor through Elwing, wife of Eärendil, daughter of Dior, son of Beren, last chieftain of the House of Beor, and seventh in direct descent from Beor. So there's a lot of description there, but basically what it tells us is the Numenoreans were of mixed race. So there's no way of knowing at that point what their skin complexion might have been. Then we get a description of the people of Gondor. The regions of Gondor had a complex history in the remote past, so far as their population was concerned, and the Numenoreans evidently found many layers of mixed peoples and numerous islands, isolated folk either clinging to old dwellings or in mountain refuges from invaders. So these are the people who the Numenoreans found, but almost undoubtedly would have intermarried with and mixed with when they got to the area that would become Gondor. So all of this from the nature of Middle-earth just basically tells us that there's no way of knowing what the skin complexion of any individual Numenorean or person of Numenorean descent would be because they are intermixed. There's all kinds of people who are part of the Numenoreans and their descendants, which is Aragorn. Now, I think some people will come to this and they'll say, yeah, but we know Aragorn's descent. We have his genealogy, and that's partially true. And we might be able to surmise what Isildur's skin color was from a fairly obscure reference. And this is a reference that I'm pulling from the Fall of Numenor, and it's the Numenorean chapters of The Lost Road. And so it can be found in a couple different places, but I'm pulling it from The Fall of Numenor, which again was a fairly recently published volume. And it's talking about a character called Eärendil, who will eventually evolve into the character of Isildur after significant amount of changes. But this might give us one small clue. A picture rose in his mind, this is Eärendil's mind, of his son. So a picture rose in his mind of Eärendil's white body, strong and beautiful upon the threshold of early manhood, cleaving the water or lying on the sand glistening in the sun. But Eärendil was not there, and the beach seemed oddly empty. All this tells us is that there was one point at which Tolkien thought of the character Eärendil, who would eventually morph into the character of Isildur, as being white. But there's no indication that I could find that he carried that forward, and the character morphs a ton to become Isildur. So we really don't know what might have changed in that passage. But even if we felt like we could assume that Isildur was white, that doesn't really give us a lot. We have Aragorn's genealogy basically straight back to Isildur on his father's side. But what we don't have a lot of information on is his mother's side. So we have very little genealogical information on his mother's side. We know that she came from the people of Numenor. She would have been descended from the men of the West. But like we already said, there were a lot of mixing going on there, and there could be any amount of intermarrying among different people in her family line. We just don't have that much of it. And in Magic the Gathering, Gilrain, Aragorn's mother, is the one who is actually depicted as black. We don't get a depiction of Arathorn, his father. We only get a depiction of Gilrain, and she is depicted as black with young Aragorn on her card. And so even if we could assume that Isildur and his descendants were white, that doesn't necessarily lead us to know that Aragorn would have been white. So in the end, what have we learned? Well, I think even after looking at these other sources, we still are kind of left in the same place that we were after looking at the sources in The Lord of the Rings, and that is that Tolkien didn't really care about what Aragorn's race was. He cared a lot more about his character and his standing as a king of men. The one trait that seems really important to him seems to be his height, because that one gets brought up several times and he's described as being taller than everyone else. And so in this, I think that if we look at these depictions from Magic the Gathering, we can see that they really did a good job of following Tolkien's description. They did as good a job as anyone, a better representation certainly than Viggo was in the movies. Just based on height alone, Viggo just wasn't taller than everyone else. Now, I said that height is not that big of a deal. This is something that's come up with the Galadriel's depiction in The Rings of Power, that she's not as tall as Galadriel should have been. But Tolkien described some of his characters as being so tall that you couldn't possibly cast actors at them. So I'm not faulting them for that. You just can't cast somebody who is 8 feet tall, which is what you would have to do for a character like Elendil. But I'm just saying that this depiction in Magic the Gathering is as accurate as anything else, because we just don't know what Aragorn's skin color actually was, and the other characteristics that they portray him as are actually quite good. He gets very kingly by those cards that are depicting him towards the end. Those are really, really nice depictions from people who worked really, really hard on this artwork, I am sure. So with all that being said, I spent a lot of time, about 2 months, doing the research for this video, but I don't have access to everything that Tolkien ever wrote, and it's easy to miss something in a volume as large as The Lord of the Rings is. So if you have other information, I would love to hear about that. Please do go ahead and leave a comment if you can adhere to the guidelines that I laid out at the beginning of this video. I am always happy to receive more information. Just make sure that you cite the source that you're using so that we know and we can look it up as well. And until next time, thank you so much for watching. Farewell wherever you fare. May your ears receive you at your journey's end.